day in the struggle. I forget up and go jungle. You don't know. Pounds and little sugar no pan. We not sleep with trouble no man. Oh, said I had a close one yesterday. Jah put an angel over me. Be strong. All of her medication.
So this is a story that I wrote in 2002. I wrote this before I met my wife. After my brother had died, I had finished it up, but I had been writing it at work when I worked at Dentrix Dental Systems for, roughly 6 months, just on my break or in my spare time. And I wanted to, be very honest and open with where I came from. I knew that my life was going to improve. I felt a real change in my life after I started, having a relationship with Jesus and finding more instruction from His words in the Bible. And I had a lot more hope at the time. I felt a lot more, inspiration and reason to live. But I didn't want to be phony. The worst thing that I found in my life was, in my parents' life, they pretended to be somebody they weren't when, they were around Mormons, when they were around people in their community. And these were people that were very close to us, but, like my mother would smoke cigarettes, and my father did too, but like at church, she taught Sunday school, but she wouldn't let anybody know she smoked cigarettes. She was very offended if anybody mentioned it. If any of us kids, mentioned my mom smoking or anything like that, she would, conceal it very well. And it was, a great crime to confess that my mother had a tobacco addiction. And so, I went through my history. I moved out at a very young age. I left home at age 12. Moved out and was working a full-time job at age 14, digging ditches for the irrigation company in Mapleton, paying my own rent by age 15, traveling around the country by age 17. I saw probably 36 states by the time I was 19. And I found the Lord and a relationship with Jesus at age 19, 20. My later months of being 19 and probably early 20, in that range, I was doing a lot of praying, a lot of soul searching, and that's what this story was about. But I go into the history of, I wanted to, talk about my story. I wanted to tell a little bit about where I came from and how I got off the streets and how I, found more hope and what my relationship with Jesus was about. And I, kind of went into some of the idiosyncrasies, the sins, the transgressions that I had made in my life. Now, mind you, this was all when I was a teenager. I, rose up at age 20, from being on the streets and having a pretty rough life to working at Microsoft and going to college. I was actually working 2 jobs. I was working at Microsoft, and at night I was delivering pizzas for Pizza Hut and taking part-time classes for network administration at Stevens Henniger College, and just really focused, and I was really proud of myself. And so I wanted to tell, the friends that I had left behind, the people that I used to party with, that I no longer party with, hey, I understand, I've been where you're at. I'm not just some kid that, grew up with everything that, wanted to, give credit to Jesus for it or something. I lived a hard life, and I saw a contrast. I was hopeless. I didn't have motivation to really try hard in life. I didn't really have, direction, and that's what this was all about. Recently, a couple of these atheists, my in-law had sicked them on me. He's a big atheist guy, and he does a lot of this YouTubing. He's probably got 50 accounts that he cycles through, and he dedicated a YouTube channel to me, with 50 videos or playlists with videos, and he made a couple of them himself and dedicated them to me. And anyway, they came and picked apart my story, and a few things they mentioned was that I had talked about how my mother put a restraining order against me when I was a kid. And so this was true, but it was when my father was fighting with me. And He tried to take my keys away from my car, and my mother was holding my arms, and my dad hit me a few times to try to get the keys away from me. And my arm got loose, and it had a little bit more elasticity to the punch because my mom was holding it back. Well, when my arm freed, I punched my dad in the forehead probably twice as hard as I would have naturally hit him, and it gave him a concussion, and he had to go to the hospital. So my mom went down to the police station to get a restraining order against me. What I found out is that since the restraining order was never served, I actually never had a restraining order against me. These atheists have mentioned that I had a restraining order against me. I never actually had one. My mom filed it on behalf of my father, so they filed it, but I never had it served to me, and my father never signed it. I mean, my father wasn't a pussy. He could take a punch. He could give a punch. He was a fighter. I mean, he was, trained in some specialty fields in the military, hand-to-hand combat. And he was a big guy. He was like 6'1", and he was a pretty strong dude. He always worked labor in his life. He always, had good exercise, and he fought a lot. I mean, I remember seeing him fight him, after being in a bar. I remember one time we were going home, and my father stopped at a rest stop, and this guy was looking over the stall at me. I was like 4 years old, and my dad took him outside, beat the hell out of the guy. So the guy that my dad beat up went and got a baseball bat out of his car, came at my dad with it. My dad took the baseball bat away and continued to beat the guy with the baseball bat until, my mom made him go and take off with the car. My dad was, lit, drunk, and still beat the hell out of this guy. And no, my dad wasn't a pussy. Like, he wouldn't have called the cops on me. But my mom, first of all, we weren't getting along. But second of all, she thought that, I had some sort of, major skills in fighting. And it wasn't even that. It was just that the punch was so hard because of the elasticity, where, she was holding me back and then he was punching me. And when my arm got loose, I punched him, and it, put him down with one punch. And I could have continued to beat him. I wasn't like trying to hurt the guy very much. I mean, I could have just sat there and wailed on him because he was down, but I just left, and I went on my merry way. I got no criminal charges over it. My mom tried to tell them how violent I was, but they saw the bruising and the problems on me, and the damage I had received, and what little they had on their side of it. So I didn't even get charged, but no, so there was no restraining order. And part of the things I talked about is like the pain that my family had between my dad's 5 children from his previous marriage and my mother, and the disagreements they had. So my dad had 5 kids from a previous marriage. I never got to know any of them until I was 30. My mom forbid them to come to our house. Like, we never had any relationship with them. During my dad's funeral, they were trying to get to see my dad, and I was trying to help him. So in order to block that, my mom called the cops on us and said that we were harassing her. Now, I was down at my dad's bedside for most of the time he was suffering cancer. There was no harassment. I was genuinely concerned about him. And so was my daughter. My 4-year-old was calling and trying to get them on the phone because my father was about to die, and she loved him. She was, like his little buddy. And anyway, because my mom did not want them to see my father before he died, she had him blocked via police, via calling the cops on 2 of my half-siblings and then myself, because I just thought it was really a terrible thing to do to my father's children that wanted to see him before he died and hadn't really got to know him their whole life. And this was the last chance, so I was trying to make it happen. So I talked about that, and in fact I'll put some videos here at the end, some context. My mother's mother talked about it, how my father would have loved to see those kids, and how my mom was treating him pretty terribly, and the abuse that my grandmother suffered at the other end of being next to my mother in the same neighborhood. Just a real violent and emotionally abusive relationship. So, and this is my mother's mother, she was like 87 and still getting terribly abused and stolen from and, emotionally abused. And then another thing that I didn't mention, because when I wrote this, I was just talking about my sins and my problems and, how I overcame them. But another thing I mentioned was, what was that? Oh, yeah, where my dad had a little taste for the wild side and how he would go out of state on business several times. And, you know, I didn't see him much as a kid. I think I talked about that in chapter 2. No, maybe it was chapter 3. Yeah, I was in chapter 3. But it was where my dad actually had gotten involved in some sort of illegal real estate thing and got charged with a felony. I found out in recent years, and I did a background check on him, and he was actually in prison in 1984. I was told he was out of state on business. He was actually in prison. A few of the other times that I knew he went to jail, it was for alcohol. He went to jail 3 times for drunk driving. And he was, like I say, pretty violent, but you know, I took from my father, I don't call the cops on people. You know, this kid that I'm talking about that's been making a big deal of my story here, not only does he call the cops on people, and, you know, this is in his criminal history where he's, you know, made false accusations against people, and then he sicked his stepdaddy on me to fight me. His stepdaddy didn't really do too well at the fight, and then they called the cops on me 3 times till we both got charged by the police for a crime. And then he, of course, ended up pleading guilty, and I got exonerated from my charges. But when they came to ask me if I wanted to press charges, because this guy came to my house and started a fight with me, I said, no, we're good. This is family. We'll deal with this in whatever other way. I don't need the cops to deal with this. And that's in the, you know, the police evidence, the recordings that the police made when they were at my house with their body camera or whatever. So, I mean, that was an interview between me and the police that I've got on this link here, and I'll show you that. But anyway, that's just to clear up a few things on here. When I wrote the story, I wasn't really trying to accuse my parents of anything. I wasn't trying to lay blame on them. And in the whole story, I didn't lay any blame on them. I didn't mention my dad's criminal history, didn't mention his drunk driving or his stays in jail or, you know, his violence. All the accusations that my sisters actually made, you know, later, you know, partially probably the reason why they were separated from my father is that my dad was very abusive to them. And one of them claimed that there was some pretty tragic abuse, and that's something I left out. I mean, I wasn't trying to villainize my parents. I was just trying to show that, hey, I started out this way. I found some hope in the Lord and reading the scriptures and, you know, seeing his sacrifice and, you know, learning about his methods of dealing with problems. And it gave me some direction and a template of living life, and it worked for me. And as far as like the end result of my story, you know, at least this was made in 2002, you know, now it's 16 years later, it's 2018. You know, I've done pretty good in life. I've been married to my wife for 16 years almost. It'll be 16 years in October. We've got 4 wonderful children. We're still together, and we're not perfect. We have our fights, but you know, we still see it through. You know, we keep our promises to each other, and you know, I worked 96-hour weeks. You know, I made a ton of money because I was a dedicated, hardworking family man. I was working for Talist Incorporated. When I got in my car accident, I was actually on the job at the time, driving home from Seattle to Northern California, got hit by a drunk driver. But I was working, you know, all over the country, helping pharmacies in hospitals with their robotics equipment. I had that job for 6 years, and I would still be there today had it not been for my accident. Before that, I worked for Microsoft, Dentrix Dental Systems, Adelphia Cable, and Quest Communications. And I've had a great career in technology with no gaps in my employment except for when I got in my car accident. So, you know, after I got off the streets and started going to work at Microsoft, going to school, you know, doing side jobs like Pizza Hut, there's never been a time in my life that I wasn't employed after that. And so I've done really good. Now, they'll nitpick and say, oh, well, you know, you had a GoFundMe fundraiser up asking for money. This is what my in-law says. Yeah, well, we went through a hurricane. My boat got sunk. I traded my house for a boat. I had a 46-foot sailboat. My boat got sunk, and I actually had gifted it after Hurricane Irma. In September, we had 2 hurricanes in the islands. We had Hurricane Irma, which is a Category 5, sunk our friend's boat in St. John. So right after that, I donated my boat to them, you know, duty-free, no strings attached. 2 weeks later, or almost 3 weeks later, Hurricane Maria hit on September 20th, sunk that boat. So they lost 2 boats. One of them was mine that I had gifted to them. And then we had the roof tore off our house, and we were displaced from our home, and we were in a refugee center. So I asked for some donations from people. And most of the people who donated were people who I had actually helped out. So when I got my settlement for my car accident, I'd paid off people's medical bills. I had helped my friends with moves, with medicine, with cannabis. People who had a daughter that had lupus or something. She needed cannabis, so we donated money towards those causes. And it was mostly those people who donated to us when we were in need. And so it's only been 7 months since we got displaced from our home. But that was the only time I've ever reached out. I've been the one on the giving end rather than the receiving end. But it was that one time where we were desperate. We went through 2 Category 5 hurricanes in less than a month and lost everything. And so, we reached out for help, and people helped us. Now, the point that I've made about that, and I've talked about socialism versus capitalism or socialism versus free will, is that I asked for people to help me, and people voluntarily help me. On the flip side of that, where I oppose socialism is where 51% of the people demand that the rest of the community donate to causes or charities that they're not interested in donating to by force. So you either donate or you go to jail. You support this cause, maybe Planned Parenthood or whatever other cause, or if you don't pay those taxes, you go to jail. And that's the difference. Is voluntarily giving to somebody is, I think, way better than forcing somebody at the end of a gunpoint to give to somebody. So that, just to clear that up. And then, like I said, at the end of this, and in fact in the description, I'll give more context just because I think it's relevant. And from my grandmother's point of view, who I consider my best friend in the whole world, she died in 2016. Jenny Nevitt Nay Barber was an amazing woman, and raised nine children. Half of them were grandchildren, and was good to everybody. Just had a heart of gold. Was an absolutely amazing person. And so that's that. And I'm just going to go ahead and play the story in audio format, and you can read it at mystory.behindZionCurtain.com, which is right there. This is just an archive, an internet archive of it. If you go to archive.org, you'll see the story in its original context from 2002. All right, peace out. Thanks for tuning in.
This Ragged Life Renewed, a spiritual cleansing of a fallen man. This is a true story of a young man caught up in a fallen world. Autobiography of Ryan Richard Thompson. Chapter 1: My Arrival. From what I have been told, and from what I can recall, my family started out with many problems. My father left a marriage in which he partially raised 5 children. The divorce as well as separating from his kids brought him much pain. My mom, who was 19 and only a few years older than my father's oldest child, lost her father when she was only 11 and struggled to have a relationship with my grandmother. They got married when my dad was 33 and my mom was 19. This is where I came into the picture. I was 8 months old when they married, and probably the last responsibility that my parents needed at this time. From the time I was a young baby, my parents had to move around a lot and stayed with family and worked odd jobs to keep food on the table. By the time I was 5, we had moved throughout 3 different states and Lord knows how many homes. It was a very lonely way to live life since making friends was difficult. We ended up in Fountain Green, Utah after a few years of moving around with the company that my father worked for. My father had been drinking while at work and got in a terrible car accident that left him in a coma for a short time. We lived in a rundown house with a wood stove for heating. Snakes and spiders could be found all over. It was a neat place to live, sort of an old farmhouse. My dad had a hard time finding work and we had a hard time keeping our stomachs full. Though my father did everything in his power to keep us happy, and this I know, but he did sometimes have a taste for the wild side of life. This is what landed us in a position of going from an income of $90,000 per year to living on government assistance. Chapter 2: Me, Mama, and the Utes. Still in Fountain Green. my mother and what she had to go through with us having 3 kids now. My sister Melissa was born in Buckeye, Arizona about 18 months prior, and then my little brother Brad was just born while struggling in Fountain Green. Still poor, desperate and frustrated because all of her responsibility my mom forged through, not to mention having 5 stepchildren from my dad's previous marriage that we're indirectly a part of our family, but old enough to be on their own by then. In Fountain Green I went to school for the first time. This was my first kindergarten class, but shortly after I started there we would move to Sandy, Utah, and I would go to kindergarten there too. There were many moves around Utah and I got to see all of Utah and its various culture. I noticed in Salt Lake County the religious, Mormon, community was far less dense than in other parts of Utah. We went to the LDS church, but I noticed that in Salt Lake City I had far more friends who went to different churches or didn't attend church at all. Many people think that Utah isn't diverse, however I think it is diverse. Utah County, which is about 85% Mormon, is far less diverse than Salt Lake County, which is declining in LDS population and is only about 55% now and will probably be less than 50% LDS in 10 years by the way the Mormon population is waning. The contrast between predominantly Mormon communities and less populated Mormon communities was always obvious, especially in the sense that in predominantly Mormon communities there seemed more of an overly rigid moral system which created a social cliché. For those who are Mormon and go to church, it gave them a sort of superiority complex, a right to look down on others. There were also much fewer minorities in a predominantly Mormon community. I remember going to school in Salt Lake City where I had many friends and neighbors of all different ethnicity and cultures. Although in Utah County and also in more densely populated Mormon communities I found that I rarely knew of anyone that wasn't a white middle-class Mormon. The only variety that I noticed was there were some that were richer and some were less than rich. But for the most part all were white and most were Mormon. Chapter 3 Mama, don't let your babies grow up to be cowboys. It took me years to get to know my dad. He was always busy and he was often out of state on business meetings. Later I found out that in 1984 he had been convicted of a felony involving real estate, and I believe he went to prison during one of these many absences in my life. He was at one time an executive type for a large worldwide construction company. He lost that job as an end result of a car accident. That is when we sold our house in Arizona and moved to Fountain Green. Dad was in the military and was involved in many community positions with the city council and the planning commission. My dad even in his lowest times was and is my hero. Eventually we moved from Fountain Green to Sandy, Utah. We were still struggling and my dad worked at a Skaggs Alpha Beta, a hardware store, and other side jobs doing construction, making very close to minimum wage at these jobs in order to support his at this time now 9 children. Child support for his other family was a great burden. In Sandy is where my youngest brother Justin was born and where we lived for about 4 years before moving to Mapleton. Times were hard in Sandy and I passed out flyers and got odd jobs so that I could afford a little fun and a little pizza every now and then. I had older friends in the neighborhood that taught me how to accomplish some of my heart's desires through petty theft. I was desperate for many things and easily led. I made stealing one of my daily activities with the support and encouragement of these friends. Certainly moving around a lot and changing schools often made me more influenced by others. It was hard changing friends so much, and having a difficult home life with parents who drank and fought a lot. We moved to a place in Utah called Mapleton. This was a place of refuge for my mother and father. Mapleton was a fairly quiet area and this made my parents feel good about life. I was destroyed emotionally as a result of having left another whole group of friends behind in Sandy. I crawled into a secret depression for a while. Eventually I met some close friends in Springville, where I went to school. There were a large group of skateboarders that at first meeting them beat me up a lot, but eventually we became good friends. But even after getting on solid ground I was still getting into trouble. I was always walking 12 miles to go from Mapleton to Payson, where my grandmother lived. Grandma Jenny, I loved being with her because she was good to me and I had 2 cousins that were a little older than me who lived with her. They took me places with them and I learned a lot from them. I loved to be with my cousin Amy. She took me to dance clubs, parties and let me hang out with her. We grew up together from the time I was 2 years old. She lived with my parents for a while when she was younger. She was like my best friend for many years. Later in life I moved in with her and her boyfriend when I was having tough times at home, when I was 14. Her boyfriend, who is her husband now, was trying on a role of being a white supremacist. He is over that now I hear, but he fit the role well when we were teens. My parents split up and I went to live with my grandmother. When my parents got back together a year later they wanted me to move back in with them. I wouldn't. When they tried to force me I tried to overdose on pills. I was tired of battling with my parents and them battling with each other. I wasn't serious about dying then, I just wanted to make a statement. After taking a bunch of pills and coming back a while later to my grandma's house, my mom had the police waiting and my parents committed me to a rehabilitation facility. Chapter 4 The Drugstore Cowboy. Being in the hospital, rehab, made me feel worse because for the first time in my life I had friends and loved ones that I could depend on and now I didn't while in this hospital. Most of the friends that I had on the outside were young girls that I had met at school. One was the love of my life, or so we thought at that point in time, who I lost contact with since my parents took me away from my grandma's house and moved me to another, new city. She and I had a really good relationship and I hated to have to leave yet another good friend. When I was released from the hospital I had to move back with my parents who were living in a trailer park in Provo, Utah. There I made some friends with girls in the neighborhood and kids at school. Provo High School, as well as being in the hospital, is where I found connections into the drug scene. This is where I met my friends who I would move in with in the near future. Several were skinheads, including my cousin's boyfriend. Racist and non-racist. We all ed about our politics, and our fears, and our hopes. But our friendship was based on pride. Lord knows that we had nothing at all to be proud of, regardless of how profound that we may have thought our accomplishments were. Another reflection of the culture that I grew up in, not only in the Mormon church but in rural Utah in general, a very tight-knit community, where a lot of prejudice and racism can be found. I moved around a lot and as a result I got to know many different types of people. The things that I noticed most in my environment is that poverty, violence, tragedy and emotional situations were always able to unite people. I guess that those things break down our pride and other such things that would normally hinder our connection to one another. I found that anger was medication for my depression. Much like other Utahans, I was prescribed with medications throughout my life. Side note, Utah doubles the national statistics for prescription drug age. There was also a lot of racism in my life. Not just because the LDS Church had a strong stance against people of color for a long time, as well as in the doctrine in the Book of Mormon. I noticed other things too, like the rioters in South Central LA in 1992 and in Miami shortly after, that made me question what I had been taught in my life. Were these people what the Mormon religion painted them out to be? I questioned the cops, the courts and the legalists of this world, and eventually religion too. For some reason I thought that if I tore things apart and put things back together that I could make sense out of my great deal of confusion. I never hated anyone and I didn't know very many people that didn't look, act and live like me. My anger was a product of an ignorance that I was raised in. Things just didn't fit together. Though I considered myself a skinhead, I had many girlfriends that were not white. I loved one girl who was full Navajo and two other girls who were twins and were mostly Hawaiian. I have always appreciated diversity as it was strongly enforced in me by my mother. Side note, the term skinhead is broad and often misrepresented. The first known skinhead groups came from England, and they consisted of men at a pub who hung out at pubs, drank and watched football, soccer. Race was seldom a matter. Their unity came from being working-class drunks typically, and even that definition doesn't give proper credit. Music and social atmosphere had a lot to do with it too. After separating my mind from skinhead ideology many years ago, when I was still a teenager, I started understanding where my misunderstandings came from. I started going to Grateful Dead concerts and rainbow gatherings to find a different atmosphere. This is where my drug problems got out of control. I found a new atmosphere, but I was way too high. I went to dance clubs and raves and things that were completely out of character for me just to find love. I wasn't very well accepted by local religionists and we, my family, Being less privileged than surrounding neighbors area made me feel a little less accepted. So hippies and free thinkers were the best thing for that moment in my stage of life. I was challenged in many other growing situations in the years to follow. I lived in a large group of people for a while with a proud Native American named Chewy, a group of Hare Krishnas, and various other teachers in a free thinker community in Provo, Utah. My friend Terry's place. I ended up at my parents' house again after a few years and I just could not grasp any sort of a stable situation. I could not hold a job, stay sober, stay content, or stay still. I was always restless and I worked awfully hard to screw things up, but I thought that I had a cause. That was my excuse. My cause was to be the most nonconformist person that I could be. I felt betrayed at many levels, especially with the hypocritical Mormon Church. This depression got me very far down. I seriously attempted suicide. In a blur of bad memories and emotions I took nearly a full bottle of antidepressants. The pills were so toxic, that I fell onto the ground in convolutions. I remember the cops showing up because my grandma sensed that there was something really wrong with me. After I got in a big fight with my mom. That's when it happened. I blacked out and fell to the floor while having a seizure. Cops and family were all around me by then, fortunately. My stomach has been messed up ever since. Chapter 5 Sleepless in Seattle. After waking up from this botched attempt on my life I was so weak that I couldn't even think clearly or move. I just laid in the hospital bed and rested. After that I had second thoughts on the idea and decided to move to Seattle. Apparently they thought that I was okay to go home, because they didn't try to institutionalize me. So I left for Seattle. Not before getting arrested one last time for marijuana possession. Eventually, after landing on the streets, and having restraining orders put against me from my mom, I moved around the USA. I traveled all over for 3 years. I pretty much lived on the streets and I had nothing. Sometimes I would get a job like washing cars or doing construction labor. Sometimes my parents sent me some money. This desperation landed me in many compromising situations. I ended up in the hospital on many occasions, beat up or something as a result of the environment that I lived in. This is where I found that my weakened sense or morals and lack of standards put me in a very vulnerable shell. Even though I let few people get close to me, sometimes my shell got broken and I had to paste back the pieces again. I was nearly desensitized to sin. I was willing to live a very dishonorable life just to continue to fight the man. I had felt betrayed by the judicial system and religionists and wanted to do drugs, and live an unruly lifestyle just to make my stand and to kill the pain of living in what many journalists and writers have labeled Utah as being an overly rigid moral system. No matter how hard that I tried to free myself, I was not able alone and I got sucked back in. Chapter 6, A Cup of Cool Water. After first leaving Utah and going to Seattle I met up with a Christian ministry called New Horizons. They were always willing to lend a warm shoulder and sit me down for a hot meal once and sometimes even twice a day. Many times that took us street kids out for an activity. They had very personal relationships with us just as they do with the Lord. They made us feel very welcome and they were very hospitable. Even though they spent hundreds and even thousands of hours serving the ministry with no financial reimbursements. Some got paid minimal salaries, and they were always joyful and always friendly. I remember Chris, Mary, Grandma Penny and so many others giving me hours of their time. Just letting me whine about how awful things had gotten. For the first time in my life, I truly experienced the love of the Lord in a true Christian fellowship. This was not religion, this was not man's take on how things should be. This was what Christ taught. This was a true relationship with the Lord, this was the everlasting word of the Lord. I was reluctant for years to accept this kind of discipline. I thought to myself, what do I know about love? How can I possibly trust something so simple? It didn't make sense to me and I ran from it. I traveled around for another 2 years. I went from Santa Cruz to Minneapolis and back several times. I stayed in many different cities and spoke to many different people about the Lord. I got the opinion and testimonies of many different people, about everything imaginable. Chapter 7 A Friend of the Who? Eventually I ended up living in Spokane, Washington. I was living with a girl and I was going to marry her. But her parents put pressure on her to leave me because I wouldn't marry her in the Mormon temple. Many times I tried to get a job and do something with my life to prove to her and her family that I was worthy. But I was not going to marry her in a temple that was built on a foundation that I didn't believe in. One time when we were living together, it was during the holidays in 1998, and times were tough. We had no food in the house and I was going to be evicted soon. My family was poor and her family hated me. So we had little hope of surviving together. So I found a car. The people selling it were going to let me pay them payments. I got in it for a test drive. The car needed a battery and my parents sent the money for it. I put it in and took it for a test drive. I was driving without a license and there was no registration. The car had been sitting for years and there was no traction on the tires. So I was driving down the highway and I tried to turn around to head home and I slipped off of the road into a nice embankment. I flooded the carburetor with gas, and I was stuck with no way to get home. It was nearly a blizzard at this time and I knew that if I flagged down a highway patrol, and that the car would get impounded and I may get a ticket or go to jail for something. So I prayed for any kind of relief. I just asked for the Lord into my life, inspired by all of the kind people and the testimonies that had been shared with me about the Lord and His mercy and love. After praying and receiving the comfort of the Lord, I got back in the car and it started immediately. I got back on the road with no push or pull. Then I drove back to where I got the car with no worry at all. I parked the car in the driveway from where I took it. It never started for me again. So I was on the Heel Tow Express again. I was going back and forth from the small mountain town that I lived in to Spokane, Washington, which was about 25 miles away. I went for a job, for food, for prayer. About 2 weeks after my experience with praying, I was hitchhiking back from Spokane. And a young man named Nathan picked me up, and to my surprise he was a youth pastor at a local church. Him and I both decided after talking about this experience that I had a few weeks prior, that this was a divine appointment between him and myself. He gave me a ride and his phone number, and offered me prayer and advice whenever I needed it. I found out that Nathan had lost his dad when he was young and he ended up on the streets at an early age in life too. I called him often and he helped me get home to Utah in March 1999, to visit with my family for a few weeks. After that I went to Minnesota to do door-to-door sales. I came back to Spokane again after realizing that I didn't have the capacity then for that kind of work. It was a scam. Chapter 8 Then came a lie. I came back to Spokane and shortly after arriving, I got picked up by Nathan while I was hitchhiking, in the very same place again. I went to his church with him that next weekend. This is when I sincerely believed in God and was moved to open the Bible and read His words. I opened it up to Matthew 10, it was the first chapter I memorized. I was living on the streets again. Walking back from Nathan's mother's house one beautiful summer day, I came upon a man who was sanding his car. He looked as though he was having a very bad day. I asked him if I could pray for him. He accepted, and then brought me in to meet his wife. By the end of that night, after feasting with them, and praying, they invited me to live with them. They actually kicked their daughter out of their house and moved me into her room. I was shocked, but I was thankful for the Lord's blessings. I got hooked up with Nathan's former church eventually too. It was a non-denominational church called the Life Center. They had a college-age group of kids, and they had a cookout in the park every Friday. I was invited to river rafting trips, Christian concerts, and to stay the night at the houses of some of the other believers. I eventually got an apartment through the House Authority of Spokane for $25 a month. I had a job selling insurance and I was making a fair wage. There were also great fellowship meetings held right around the corner from my house. At one of these Bible studies, we read Romans 13 and I was convicted to be accountable for my actions. I was mad about all of the hypocrisy that I seen around me. That convicted me even more. I had warrants in Utah for possession of marijuana. I was still smoking marijuana. Thinking to myself that the Lord made it, so why not use it? But I was convicted that even using those kinds of drugs are pharmacea or witchcraft. Ref. Deuteronomy. It was when the Bible study leader was smoking a cigarette, and he told me that smoking marijuana was wrong in the eyes of God, This is where I learned the word pharmacia. He made so much effort to convict me of that. I got mad, and that is when I truly questioned my need for using marijuana. I found that there was no need at all, that it was simply a desire, that I could do without. I knew that it was best do to without it anyway. So I came back to Utah being convicted that I should not be using marijuana or any other drug, and so I turned myself in on 4 separate warrants, all for possession of marijuana. Update. I now use cannabis as a treatment for severe headaches as of 2008. When I got out, my family was reluctant to let me come back, but they seen the change that the Lord has been making in my life, and they were inspired to participate in my life again. I lived with them for 2 years. During that time my youngest brother Justin overdosed and died. It was one of the most awakening experiences in my life. Life is so fragile. Chapter 9, Changes in Latitude, Changes in Attitude. Now I am married and I have a wonderful family with a new baby in the house and a wonderful wife. I have seen many of my life situations change. Many people around me change, and many of the ideals of this world change. There is one thing that I am certain of in this world, is that the Lord is faithful, even when I am faithless. By Ryan Thompson, 2002. This story was written in 2002. I have made a few updates to the story as I have learned more about the early part of my life. For instance, I spoke about how my father was out of state for business a lot, but in reality my parents were often separated, and at least one of those times it was because my dad had to serve time because of a felony conviction for some kind of real estate transaction. He also was convicted of at least 3 drinking and driving crimes. Other parts of this story was originally edited out, because my mother insisted, and to keep in good graces with her, I obliged. However, I have not spoke with her in over 9 years, except for once when my grandmother died. A lot has taken place since I wrote this. You can see more at www.utahpirateradio.com and www.behindZionCurtain.com. My brother who passed away in 2002 has a memorial website at www.justinthompson.com. I will eventually update this story and write it with more context. The original story is archived at www.archive.org. You can look up the original story from 2002 at mystery.behindthescenecurtain.com.